Hello, Vincent and Charles. I would love to know Mr. Coulombe's opinion on the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. There are many differing opinions on Yugoslavia as a whole. Of course, it arose following the collapse of Austria Hungary, so something great had to die for it to come into being, which I think colors a lot of people's disposition towards the country. Some say it was one of the greatest losses of the 20th century. On the other hand, many people say that Yugoslavia was doomed to fail from the start because of its ethnic and religious divisions.
Oh.
So, on its own, is the Kingdom of Yugoslavia something that should be looked at fondly? Was it something that could have worked long term without the looming threat of possible invasion that brought them together in the first place? Or was the motto, one people, one king, one state, a pipe dream all along?
Well, I would say it was probably something of a pipe dream all along. I mean, the Croats and Slovenes on the one hand, and the Bosniaks, and the Serbs on the other, they don't really, I mean, their languages are similar. The Slovenes less so, but the Croats and the Serbs, their language is very similar. But their cultures are quite different. Their religion, of course, is different. And they just had centuries of very different experience behind them that made them very different peoples. Um, Serbia is a country I feel particularly sad for because you figure they started the 20th century as this little country that was just south of the Danube, and it was a small place. Then, during the First and Second Balkan Wars, they were able to conquer what's now Kosovo and all the way down to and including Macedonia. And that was Serbia in 1914. Well, after World War One, they annexed Montenegro, and then they go into this sort of shotgun wedding with the Croats and Slovenes and so on. But from the very beginning, on the one hand, the Serbs were dominant, and on the other, the Croats and the Slovenes and so forth came very quickly to resent them. So I think the breakup of Austria-Hungary was a mistake, and I think that the incorporation of Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia and Yugoslavia was probably a mistake as well. Uh, what's interesting, though, interesting story from the end of the empire. There were a group of Serbs from Croatia, imperial Serbs, if you will, who were fighting a royal Serb unit, and it was literally at the end. Everything was falling apart. So the royal Serbs said to their imperial counterparts, everything's falling apart with you guys, surrender. And the response was, you of all people should know we Serbs never surrender.
Hmm.
That
Okay.
that was an interesting take. But now, having said that, uh, I have a lot of regard for the last king of Yugoslavia, the last of the two, well, the three, I guess, Peter the First, Alexander, and Peter the Second. Peter the Second was a nice fellow who was, in a horrible position, and he incidentally, uh, he was of the opinion that the annexation of Croatia, etc., was a mistake, and that if they wanted to go their own way, they should have been allowed to. Peter, a very sad fellow, died in the United States in Colorado, and he had his funeral, the only royal funeral on American soil outside Hawaii, at the little Serbian church in Arcadia, not too far from your place on
Yeah.
Baldwin.
Yeah.
So I always think of poor King Peter, and I say a prayer for him whenever I drove past it.
Hmm.
He, interesting fellow. The other thing too, is I'm going to say about Serbia, was that all that bloodshed in the two wars for the establishment of Yugoslavia as a sort of Greater Serbia, and then they lost it all, and now, except for the Vojvodina, which was really part of Hungary, the Banat, north of the Danube, they're almost down to what they were in 1900. And you find yourself asking, what was all that about? What was that for? It's not like even the Serbs really benefited from it. They were on this wild adventure that led them into horror and bloodshed. And of course, World War II was particularly bad for them. So yeah, I'm very sad for the Serbs. I really am. Even that war, World War One, the Archduke was murdered by a fellow who was working unknowingly for the Serbian Secret Service, and the mastermind behind the plot, who was his code name was Apis. I forget his real name, but he ended up being executed by the Serbian government itself 2 years into the war for other reasons. But you find yourself saying, why?
Yeah. Was the motto "One people, one king, one state" a pipe dream all along?
I think so. I mean, there was no way you were going to get one people out of them. King Alexander tried, and it didn't work. And see, the thing was that the Croats and all that had been subjected by the Hungarians to Magyarization, and it didn't work. There was no way it was going to work with the Serbs.
Okay, so for someone who... So I'm not familiar with the differences of this area. How are their differences more difficult to reconcile than the Italian states, the different states in Italy?
Well, the different states in Italy had the same language and the same religion. There was an awful lot of bitterness over their forced unification, as evidenced by the fact that millions of Italians, including your own people, left the country after the Risorgimento, which before, immigration out of Italy was minimal. But as soon as the country was united, you had millions of Italians move to America and Argentina and Canada and Australia and all the settler
Wasn't that
countries.
over other things, though?
It started, those other things were introduced by the new Sardinian government. Conscription, which the old governments hadn't had. Heavy taxation, which the old governments hadn't had. One reason, you see, the reason why Sardinia was able to knock them over like so many bowling pins was that Count Cavour, from about 1840 on, did two things. One, he militarized Sardinia. He raised the biggest standing army on the peninsula, and he upped the taxes like nobody's business on the Sardinian people. So by the time, in 1859, by the time he was ready to go to war, he had both a lot of dough to do it with and a lot of troops to fight with. Well, when the Italian states were finally conquered, they established a centralized government which taxed and conscripted the way the Sardinians have been taxed and conscripted. But a lot of southern and other Italians wouldn't stand still for it. So off they went. But that was the result of the Risorgimento.
But the northern Italians didn't seem to mind.
Well, no, that's because they were running the show. The Italians are a funny bunch. You won't know this being one, but they are a funny bunch in the sense that, due to their geography and so forth, they've always been a very disunited people since the fall of the Roman Empire. And even the states that we know of in the 19th century were themselves agglomerations of city-states, one of which conquered the others. Florence to establish Tuscany, Modena, Parma, etc. But they were very, very regional oriented, very localist oriented, and so uniting them was very difficult. But they all had the same language. They all had the same religion.
When you say religion, so what religions were divisive in Yugoslavia? It's just the different Orthodoxies?
No. The Croats and Slovenes are Catholic. The Bosniaks are Muslim, and the Serbs and Macedonians are Orthodox.
Well, doesn't Russia handle that? I mean, Russia, because I remember on a Putin interview, he was actually proud of that. He felt that the different factions, the different ethnicities and religions that you just mentioned, Muslim, Orthodox, and Catholic, there's no problem because there's such a long history. Is
Well,
he telling a tale here?
it's not exactly telling a tale, but you've got to bear in mind also that Catholics and Muslims are a small minority in Russia.
Hmm.
It would be very different if they were half and half.
Hmm.
And the other thing too is that the Croats and the Slovenes who favored incorporation to Yugoslavia did so under the idea and the assurance that their languages and so forth would have equal status with Serb and that they would have autonomy. Now, that's not what happened. Even the name Yugoslavia is a reflection of that, because when it was first proclaimed, it was the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And 4 years later, it was renamed Yugoslavia.
Okay.
You are not going to make one people out of those guys. But an interesting thing I find about Serbs and Croats, they dislike each other intensely. But in the diaspora, in the United States, Australia, Canada, and so forth, if you find Serbs, you'll find Croats. Now, why would they do that? Why would they go to Melbourne or San Pedro, California, just to be close when they dislike one another so much? That doesn't make sense.
Do they have the same food?
Similar.
I don't know.
Oh well, but I wish them all well. I wish everybody well. Everybody should be happy. I'm all in favor of goodness.